The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. Lieutenant Marcus Chen stood among 37 other candidates, all elite soldiers handpicked from various military branches, around the world for the most classified mission in recent history. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as men who had survived the toughest military training known to mankind waited to learn about their next challenge. Admiral Harrison stepped to the podium, his weathered face bearing the scars of decades in special operations. Behind him, a massive screen displayed satellite images of a fortress-like compound nestled in the mountains of Eastern Europe. The structure looked medieval, with towering stone walls and narrow windows that seemed to peer down like watchful eyes. "Gentlemen," Admiral Harrison began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "What you're looking at is Castle Kronberg, abandoned for over a century but recently occupied by a terrorist organization calling themselves the Iron Brotherhood. Intelligence suggests they're holding 12 American diplomats hostage, including the Secretary of State's daughter." The room remained silent, but Marcus could feel the tension rise. Every man present had been through hell to earn his place in elite units, but something about this mission felt different. The Admiral continued, his tone growing more serious. "The castle sits on a cliff face 3,000 feet above sea level. There's only one road leading to it, heavily fortified with anti-aircraft systems. The walls are 40 feet high and 8 feet thick. The Iron Brotherhood has turned this place into an impregnable fortress using modern technology combined with medieval architecture." A Navy SEAL commander raised his hand. "Sir, what's our insertion method?" Admiral Harrison clicked a remote, and the screen changed to show aerial reconnaissance footage. "That's the problem. Traditional helicopter insertion is impossible due to the terrain and air defenses. The cliff face is too steep for climbing, and the single road is a death trap. We've run 17 different simulations, and every conventional approach results in mission failure with catastrophic casualties." Marcus studied the images carefully. He had been selected for this mission not just because of his combat skills, but because of his unique background. Before joining the military, he had spent his childhood in Nepal, where his father worked as a geological surveyor. Marcus had learned to climb the world's most dangerous peaks with the Sherpa guides, developing skills that most soldiers never acquired. "The mission parameters are simple," Admiral Harrison continued. "Extract all 12 hostages alive. The Iron Brotherhood has made it clear that any rescue attempt will result in immediate execution of all prisoners. They have motion sensors, thermal imaging, and enough firepower to hold off a small army." Another candidate, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, from Delta Force, spoke up. "Sir, if the Navy SEALs can't crack this nut, what makes you think we can?" The Admiral's expression grew grim. "Because 3 days ago, SEAL Team 6 attempted an assault. They lost 4 men and barely escaped with their lives. The enemy was ready for them, almost like they knew exactly how our forces would approach." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. SEAL Team 6 was legendary, the unit that had taken down bin Laden. If they couldn't succeed, what hope did anyone else have? Marcus found himself thinking about his grandfather, who had served in the Gurkha Regiment during World War II. The old man used to tell stories about impossible missions, about times when conventional thinking failed, and only creativity could save lives. His grandfather always said, "When everyone else thinks like a soldier, you must think like a ghost." The terrorist leader calls himself Victor the Iron, Admiral Harrison continued. "Former special forces from multiple countries, dishonorably, discharged for war crimes. He's assembled a team of mercenaries who know exactly how special forces operate because they used to be special forces themselves." The screen showed surveillance photos of the terrorists. Each face looked hardened, professional, deadly. These weren't amateur fighters or desperate criminals. They were trained killers who had turned their skills toward evil purposes. Intelligence suggests they're planning to execute one hostage every 48 hours until their demands are met. The first execution is scheduled for tomorrow at noon. The President has authorized any means necessary to prevent this. Marcus raised his hand. "Sir, what exactly are their demands?" The release of 37 imprisoned terrorists from various countries plus $50 million in cryptocurrency. The international community has agreed this cannot happen, as it would only encourage more kidnappings. As the briefing continued, Marcus began to formulate ideas. While the other candidates focused on firepower and assault tactics, his mind wandered to the unconventional approaches his grandfather had taught him. Sometimes the most direct path wasn't the best path. Sometimes you had to think like water, finding the smallest crack and flowing through it. The admiral dismissed the group with orders to report back at dawn for mission planning. As the candidates filed out, Marcus lingered, studying the satellite images one more time. There had to be something everyone was missing, some weakness in the fortress that conventional military thinking couldn't see. That evening, Marcus sat in his quarters, sketching the castle layout from memory. He had requested additional reconnaissance, photos, focusing not on the obvious defensive positions but on the seemingly insignificant details. The drainage systems, the weathering patterns on the stone walls, the vegetation growing near the foundation. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister back home. "Dad says you always find a way when everyone else gives up. Stay safe, little brother." Marcus smiled, remembering how his father used to take him rock climbing in the Himalayas. The old man always said that every mountain had a secret path, but you had to be willing to look where others wouldn't dare to search. As he drifted, off to sleep, Marcus dreamed of his grandfather's voice. "Beta, when the strongest warriors fail, sometimes it takes the quietest approach to win. The enemy expects thunder, so perhaps you must become the whisper." Tomorrow would bring another planning session, another group of brilliant military minds trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. But Marcus already knew that conventional thinking had failed. If they were going to save those hostages, someone would have to attempt the impossible. The question was whether anyone would be brave enough or crazy enough to try what had never been attempted before. As dawn approached, Marcus realized that someone might have to be him. The second day of mission planning began before sunrise. Marcus arrived at the briefing room to find chaos erupting among the assembled Special Forces operators. Heated voices filled the air as elite soldiers from different units argued over tactics, each convinced their approach was superior. "We go in hard and fast," insisted Commander Blake from the Navy SEALs. "Overwhelming force is our only option." "That's exactly what got your team killed 3 days ago," snapped Captain Williams from the SAS. "We need precision, not brute force." Colonel Thompson from Delta Force slammed his fist on the table. "Both of you are wrong. This requires surgical strikes from multiple angles simultaneously." Admiral Harrison entered the room, and the arguments ceased immediately. His face showed the strain of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. "Gentlemen, while you've been debating tactics, I've received word from our intelligence assets inside the castle. The terrorists executed the first hostage an hour ago." The room fell silent as the weight of failure settled on everyone's shoulders. A young diplomat named Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus despite sharing his surname, had died while the world's best soldiers argued about strategy. "Furthermore," the admiral continued, "our satellite surveillance shows the terrorists are moving the remaining hostages to a more secure location deep within the castle's underground chambers. The window for conventional rescue is closing rapidly." Marcus studied the new intelligence photos spread across the conference table. The castle's lower levels formed a maze of stone corridors and chambers carved directly into the mountain. Anyone attempting a rescue would face not only the terrorists, but also the risk of getting lost in the labyrinth below. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez voiced what everyone was thinking. "Sir, with respect, if we can't crack the surface defenses, how are we supposed to navigate those underground tunnels?" Before Admiral Harrison could respond, Marcus stepped forward. "What if we're approaching this completely wrong?" The room turned to look at the quiet lieutenant who rarely spoke during briefings. Commander Blake scoffed. "Chen, you're Army infantry. This is special operations planning." Marcus ignored the dismissive tone and moved to the satellite images. "Everyone's been focusing on how to break into the castle, but what if we don't break in at all?" "What are you talking about?" Colonel Thompson demanded. Marcus pointed to a series of small dark spots on the cliff face below the castle. These shadows here, they're not random. I've seen similar formations in Nepal. They're caves, probably connected to the underground chamber system. Captain Williams leaned in for a closer look. Even if you're right, those caves would be hundreds of feet down a sheer cliff face. It's suicide. Not if you know how to climb. Marcus replied quietly. My father was a geological surveyor. I spent my childhood learning to navigate cave systems in the Himalayas. These limestone formations always connect. Admiral Harrison studied Marcus with new interest. Explain your thinking, Lieutenant. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing his next words would either save lives or end his military career. Sir, every rescue attempt has failed because we're trying to fight our way through their strongest defenses. But medieval castles were built to keep armies out, not to keep individuals from climbing up from below. The room erupted in skeptical murmurs, but Marcus continued. The terrorists are watching the road, the airspace, and the walls. They're not watching a cliff face that everyone assumes is impossible to climb. Commander Blake shook his head. Chen, even if you could somehow scale that cliff and find these supposed caves, you'd be going in alone against 30 armed terrorists. Not to fight them, Marcus replied. To map the underground system and establish an entry point for a coordinated rescue. Colonel Thompson studied the images more carefully. The kid might have something. If someone could get inside undetected and disable their security systems, it's still a suicide mission, Captain Williams argued. One man against impossible odds. Marcus felt his grandfather's voice echoing in his mind. The old Gurkha had always said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite fear. Sir, with respect, 11 people are going to die tomorrow if we don't try something different. Admiral Harrison was quiet for several long moments, studying both the satellite images and Marcus's determined expression. Lieutenant Chen, are you volunteering for this mission? Yes, sir. The room fell silent again as the gravity of the proposal settled in. Commander Blake spoke first. Admiral, I can't recommend sending one soldier on what amounts to a suicide mission. Neither can I, agreed Colonel Thompson. But I also can't recommend watching 11 more hostages die while we debate conventional tactics. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed the group a photo of himself scaling a near vertical rock face in the Himalayas. This was taken when I was 16, climbing the north face of Ahmedablam with my Sherpa guide. The cliff at Castle Kronberg is actually less technical than what I trained on as a teenager. Captain Williams examined the photo closely. Even if you could make the climb, how do you plan to navigate the underground system without getting lost? Marcus smiled for the first time since the briefing began. My grandfather served in the Gurkha regiment during World War II. He taught me that every fortress has a heart, and once you find the heart, you can feel the pulse of the entire structure. Admiral Harrison leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing, Lieutenant? Give me 24 hours, sir. Let me make the climb and map the underground system. I'll establish entry points and disable security systems from the inside. Then your teams can execute a rescue operation with the element of surprise restored. The Special Forces commanders exchanged glances, each seeing the desperation in the other's eyes. Every conventional approach had failed and time was running out. What equipment would you need? Admiral Harrison asked. Marcus had been thinking about this all night. Climbing gear rated for alpine conditions, night vision equipment, and a communication system that can penetrate stone walls. No weapons initially. If I'm caught, I need to appear as non-threatening as possible. Commander Blake looked incredulous. Non-threatening? You're planning to infiltrate a terrorist stronghold. I'm planning to become a ghost, Marcus replied, remembering his grandfather's words. Ghosts don't carry guns. Colonel Thompson studied the cliff face measurements. The approach would take at least 6 hours in total darkness. If you're discovered during the climb, then the mission fails, and we're no worse off than we are now. Marcus finished. Admiral Harrison made his decision. Lieutenant Chen, you have 18 hours to prepare. If you can establish entry points and disable their perimeter security, we'll have the other teams ready for immediate insertion. As the briefing dispersed, Marcus felt the weight of 11 lives settling on his shoulders. Every special forces operator in the room was better trained and more experienced than him, yet somehow the mission had fallen to an infantry lieutenant who had learned to climb mountains as a child. That evening, Marcus called his sister one more time. "Tell Dad I remember everything he taught me about reading stone and finding the path that others can't see." "Marcus, what's going on? You sound different." "I'm about to do something that would make Grandfather proud," he replied. "If something happens to me, don't talk like that. You always find a way." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that finding a way was exactly what he had to do. 11 lives depended on it. The helicopter dropped Marcus 3 miles from the castle at exactly midnight. He landed in a dense forest, the rotor wash disappearing into the darkness as the aircraft vanished back toward friendly territory. For the first time in days, he was completely alone with nothing but his climbing gear and the impossible mission ahead. Marcus moved through the forest like his Sherpa guides had taught him, stepping carefully to avoid breaking branches or disturbing the natural sounds of the night. Every few hundred yards he stopped to listen, letting his ears adjust to the ambient sounds of wind through trees and distant mountain streams. As he approached the cliff base, the castle loomed above him like a sleeping giant. Lights flickered in several windows, and he could make out the silhouettes of guards patrolling the walls. Intelligence reports suggested 30 terrorists inside, but Marcus knew the actual number could be higher. He reached the cliff face at 2 a.m. and immediately began studying the limestone formations. His father's geological training came flooding back as he identified the stress patterns in the rock. This cliff had been shaped by millions of years of water flow, creating natural handholds and ledges that weren't visible from satellite photos. Marcus secured his climbing rope to a sturdy tree and began his ascent. The first 100 feet were the most dangerous because he was still within range of the castle's perimeter sensors. He moved slowly, testing each handhold before committing his weight, remembering his grandfather's advice about patience being a warrior's greatest weapon. The limestone was treacherous, made slick by mountain mist and decades of weather. Several times, chunks of rock broke away under his grip, sending small avalanches tumbling into the darkness below. Each sound made him freeze, listening for any indication that the guards above had noticed. At the 200-foot mark, Marcus found what he was looking for: a dark opening in the cliff face, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. He activated his night vision goggles and peered inside, seeing a natural tunnel that angled upward into the mountain. The cave system was exactly what he had hoped to find. Water erosion had created a network of passages that honeycombed the entire cliff, probably connecting to the castle's foundation drainage system. Marcus pulled out his communications equipment and whispered into the encrypted radio. "Base, this is Ghost. I've found the entry point. Beginning underground reconnaissance." Admiral Harrison's voice crackled back through the static. "Acknowledged, Ghost. You have 4 hours until dawn. Don't take unnecessary risks." Marcus squeezed into the tunnel and began crawling upward through passages that hadn't seen human presence in centuries. The limestone walls were covered with mineral deposits that glittered in his night vision, creating an otherworldly landscape of crystal formations and flowing stone. The tunnel system was more complex than he had anticipated. Multiple passages branched off in different directions, some leading to dead ends while others opened into larger chambers. Marcus used his father's surveying techniques, dropping small markers and mapping each turn to ensure he could find his way back. After an hour of careful navigation, Marcus heard something that made his heart race: human voices echoing from somewhere above. He was getting close to the castle's inhabited areas. He moved even more carefully now, knowing that a single loose stone could alert the terrorists to his presence. The passage suddenly opened into a natural chamber about the size of a small room. Marcus played his flashlight across the walls and discovered something incredible: medieval stonework mixed with natural limestone. The castle's builders had incorporated the existing cave system into their foundation, creating storage areas and escape routes that didn't appear on any modern blueprints. Marcus found a narrow staircase carved into the living rock, obviously ancient but still structurally sound. He began climbing, counting steps and estimating his position relative to the castle above. The stairs led to a heavy wooden door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. He pressed his ear against the wood and heard nothing. Slowly, carefully, he tested the old iron handle. The door was unlocked but swollen with age and moisture. Marcus applied gradual pressure until it opened just enough for him to peer through. He was looking into the castle's wine cellar, rows of dusty bottles stretching into darkness. More importantly, he could hear footsteps and voices from the floor above. The terrorists were using the main castle for their operations, apparently unaware of the ancient passages beneath their feet. Marcus activated his radio and whispered his location. "Base, I'm inside the castle's lower level. The cave system connects directly to the foundation. I can hear terrorist activity on the floor above." "Outstanding, Ghost. What's your assessment for entry points?" Marcus studied the cellar layout, noting several staircases leading upward. "I count at least 3 access routes to the main level. The underground system could accommodate a small team moving undetected." "Negative, Ghost. Intelligence intercepts suggest the hostages have been moved to a central location. We need you to locate them before we can plan extraction." The mission was becoming more complex by the minute. Marcus left his equipment in the wine cellar and began exploring the castle's ground floor, moving like the ghost his call sign suggested. The medieval architecture worked in his favor, with thick stone walls that muffled sound and deep shadows that concealed movement. He reached a main corridor and heard voices speaking in accented English. Pressing himself against the stone wall, Marcus listened to 2 terrorists discussing guard rotations. From their conversation, he learned that the hostages were being held in the castle's Great Hall, the most secure location in the structure. Marcus began working his way toward the Great Hall, using service corridors and abandoned rooms to avoid detection. The castle was larger than the satellite images had suggested, with multiple levels and countless chambers. Several times he had to freeze in doorways as armed terrorists passed by, their boots echoing on the ancient stone floors. As he approached the Great Hall, Marcus could hear different voices, American accents, frightened but alive. The hostages were definitely in there, but accessing the room would require getting past multiple guards and sophisticated security systems. He found a position where he could observe the Great Hall's entrance without being seen. 2 armed guards stood outside massive wooden doors while camera systems monitored every angle. Motion sensors and infrared devices had been added to the medieval architecture, creating a high-tech fortress within ancient walls. Marcus activated his radio one more time. "Base, I've located the hostages. Great Hall, Central Castle, multiple security systems and armed guards. This isn't going to be a simple extraction." Admiral Harrison's response was immediate. "Ghost, new intelligence suggests the terrorists are planning to execute another hostage at dawn. We're running out of time." Looking at the heavily defended Great Hall, Marcus realized that his solo reconnaissance mission had just become something much more dangerous. If another hostage was going to die in a few hours, someone had to act immediately. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in his mind, "Beta, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is the thing everyone else says is impossible." Marcus checked his equipment and began planning an approach that would either save 11 lives or end his own. Dawn was only 2 hours away, and he was the only person in position to prevent another execution. The boy who had learned to climb impossible peaks was about to attempt the most impossible climb of all, getting 11 people out of a terrorist fortress while the world's best soldiers waited helplessly outside. Marcus crouched in the shadows near the Great Hall, watching the guards and studying their patrol patterns. He had 90 minutes before dawn, 90 minutes before another innocent person would die. Every Special Forces manual he had ever read said this situation was impossible for one person to handle, but those manuals hadn't been written by someone who learned patience from Sherpa guides. The Great Hall's security system was sophisticated, but had one weakness that only someone with his background would notice. The medieval architecture included massive stone pillars that supported the vaulted ceiling, and these pillars created blind spots in the camera coverage. More importantly, the thermal sensors were designed to detect movement at floor level, not someone moving 20 feet above on the ancient wooden beams. Marcus returned to the wine cellar and retrieved specific items from his gear: climbing rope, night vision equipment, and something he hadn't mentioned in his mission briefing: lock-picking tools his grandfather had taught him to use during stories of wartime espionage behind Japanese lines. He made his way to a service staircase that led to the castle's upper levels, moving like smoke through the ancient corridors. The terrorists had obviously studied modern security systems, but they hadn't considered the three-dimensional possibilities of medieval architecture. On the second floor, Marcus found what he was looking for: access to the Great Hall's ceiling structure. Through gaps in the ancient stonework, he could see down into the hall where 11 Americans sat huddled together, their hands bound but their spirits not yet broken. The terrorist leader, Victor the Iron, stood near the hostages speaking into a radio. Even from his elevated position, Marcus could see the man's cold efficiency as he planned the next execution. Several other terrorists were positioned around the hall, all carrying automatic weapons and looking professionally alert. Marcus secured his climbing rope to a massive wooden beam and began lowering himself silently toward the hall floor. The rope was black and nearly invisible in the dim lighting, and his descent was so slow that the motion sensors couldn't detect the gradual movement. 20 feet above the floor, Marcus stopped his descent and began studying the layout more carefully. The hostages were grouped in the center of the hall with guards positioned at every exit. The security control panel was located near the main entrance, operated by a terrorist who looked bored with his monitoring duties. Marcus pulled out his grandfather's lock-picking tools and smiled grimly. The old Gurkha had always said that sometimes the oldest skills were more valuable than the newest technology. If he could disable the security system and create confusion, the hostages might have a chance to escape during the chaos. He began working his way along the ceiling beams, moving from pillar to pillar like a spider navigating its web. The wooden beams creaked occasionally under his weight, but the sounds were masked by wind outside and the terrorists' conversations below. Marcus reached a position directly above the security control station. The operator sat alone, confident that his high-tech systems made human vigilance unnecessary. That overconfidence was about to cost him everything. Marcus waited until the guard's attention was focused on his radio, then dropped silently behind him. Before the man could react, Marcus had him in a sleeper hold that his grandfather had learned from Japanese prisoners of war. The terrorist collapsed unconsciously without making a sound. Now Marcus had access to the security system's control panel, but he faced a new problem. Disabling the alarms without alerting the other guards would require technical knowledge he didn't possess. The panel was covered with switches and displays labeled in multiple languages, none of which he could read in the darkness. He decided to trust his grandfather's philosophy about simple solutions to complex problems. Instead of trying to understand the system, Marcus began systematically removing every cable and wire he could find. If he couldn't turn off the security system properly, he would break it completely. Sparks flew from the control panel as Marcus pulled out handfuls of wiring. Alarms began sounding throughout the castle, but not the controlled alarms the terrorists expected. These were the harsh, discordant sounds of electronic systems failing catastrophically. The Great Hall erupted in confusion as guards rushed toward various exits, trying to determine what had gone wrong. Victor the Iron was shouting orders in multiple languages, but his men were trained for coordinated attacks, not equipment failures that left them blind and deaf to threats. Marcus dropped from the ceiling into the chaos, landing among the hostages like an apparition materializing from nowhere. "I'm Lieutenant Chen, United States Army," he whispered urgently. "Stay calm and follow my lead." The Secretary of State's daughter, Jennifer, looked at him with wide eyes. "Are you here alone?" "Backup is coming, but we need to move now." "Marcus," replied, cutting their bonds with his grandfather's knife. "Can everyone walk?" Most of the hostages nodded, though several showed signs of abuse and exhaustion. Marcus helped them to their feet while keeping one eye on the confused terrorists who were still trying to restore their security systems. "There's a service corridor behind that tapestry," Marcus whispered, pointing to an ancient wall hanging that concealed a narrow doorway. It leads to the wine cellar and then to an escape route through the mountain. As the hostages began moving toward the hidden exit, Victor the Iron finally realized what was happening. The terrorist leader's roar of rage echoed through the Great Hall as he spotted the Americans attempting to escape. "Kill them all!" Victor screamed, raising his automatic weapon. Marcus stepped between the terrorist leader and the hostages, knowing he had no weapon and no backup. This was the moment his grandfather had prepared him for without either of them knowing it. The moment when all training and courage would be tested against impossible odds. Victor smiled coldly as he aimed his IQ rifle at Marcus. So the Americans finally found someone brave enough to die for these sheep. "Actually," Marcus replied quietly, "I found someone stupid enough to ignore his own security protocols." Before Victor could ask what he meant, Marcus activated the emergency beacon hidden in his equipment. The signal he sent wasn't a call for backup. It was coordinates for the artillery strike that Admiral Harrison had positioned as a last resort. The first shell hit the castle's north wall 30 seconds later, shaking the ancient structure to its foundations. Victor and his men were thrown to the ground as medieval stonework began collapsing around them. "Move!" Marcus shouted to the hostages, pushing them toward the escape route as the castle began coming apart above their heads. Jennifer grabbed his arm as they reached the concealed doorway. "What about you?" Marcus looked back at Victor, who was struggling to his feet among the rubble and dust. The terrorist leader's rifle was buried under fallen stones, but his eyes burned with murderous intent. "Someone has to make sure he doesn't follow," Marcus replied, knowing that his grandfather would have understood the necessity of this final sacrifice. As the hostages disappeared into the service corridor, Marcus turned to face Victor the Iron in single combat, armed with nothing but a knife and the courage of a boy who had learned to climb impossible mountains. The shells continued falling outside, but inside the Great Hall, two men prepared to settle their differences the way warriors had done for thousands of years, with nothing but skill, determination, and the willingness to die for what they believed in. Victor the Iron stood amid the rubble of his collapsing fortress, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead but his eyes burning with the fury of a cornered predator. The artillery bombardment continued outside, each explosion shaking loose centuries-old stones from the castle walls. "You think you've won, little soldier?" Victor snarled, pulling a combat knife from his boot. "I've killed better men than you with my bare hands." Marcus circled slowly, his grandfather's knife feeling light in his grip. The blade was old, but perfectly balanced, carried by 3 generations of Gurkha warriors before coming to him. "I don't need to win," Marcus replied calmly. "I just need to buy them time to get away." Victor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the crumbling hall. "They'll never make it through those tunnels alive. My men know every passage in this mountain." "Your men are busy trying not to get buried alive," Marcus pointed out, dodging as a large stone crashed down where he had been standing moments before. The terrorist leader was bigger and stronger than Marcus, with the kind of brutal experience that came from years of warfare without rules. But Marcus had learned fighting techniques from his grandfather that weren't taught in any military manual, methods developed by mountain warriors who had to defeat larger enemies using speed, cunning, and absolute commitment. Victor attacked with the straightforward aggression of conventional military training, powerful thrusts designed to end the fight quickly. Marcus responded with the fluid movements his grandfather had shown him, deflecting rather than blocking, using his opponent's strength against him. "Stand still and die like a man," Victor roared, frustrated by Marcus's evasive tactics. "My grandfather taught me that only fools fight fair," Marcus replied, using a fallen stone as a springboard to leap over Victor's charging attack. As they fought among the collapsing architecture, Marcus could hear distant voices echoing from the escape tunnels. The hostages were making progress, but they needed more time to reach the extraction point where Admiral Harrison's teams were waiting. Victor seemed to realize this as well, because his attacks became more desperate and reckless. He began throwing chunks of rubble while advancing with his knife, trying to overwhelm Marcus through sheer aggression. A piece of falling masonry struck Marcus's shoulder, sending him stumbling into a stone pillar. Victor seized the opportunity, lunging forward with his combat knife aimed at Marcus's heart. Marcus twisted away at the last instant, feeling the blade slice through his uniform but miss vital organs. As Victor's momentum carried him forward, Marcus grabbed the terrorist's wrist and used a technique his grandfather had called the mountain's embrace, redirecting all of Victor's force into the stone pillar behind him. The impact stunned Victor momentarily, but he recovered quickly and backhanded Marcus across the face with enough force to send him sprawling. Stars exploded across Marcus's vision as he hit the floor hard, his grandfather's knife skittering away into the darkness. "Now you die, ghost," Victor sneered, raising his combat knife for the killing blow. Marcus rolled desperately as the blade sparked against stone where his head had been. He came up near one of the great hall's ancient fireplaces where centuries-old iron tools hung on rusted hooks. Victor advanced confidently, certain of victory now that his opponent was weaponless and wounded. "Your American friends will join you soon enough. My remaining men will hunt them through those tunnels like rats." Marcus's hand closed around a heavy iron poker that medieval servants had once used to tend fires. It wasn't balanced like his grandfather's knife, but it had reach and weight that might give him one last chance. "Actually," Marcus gasped, struggling to his feet, "your remaining men have bigger problems to worry about." On cue, explosions echoed from the castle's lower levels as the artillery strike reached the ammunition storage areas that Victor's organization had established in the medieval dungeons. The entire structure shuddered as secondary explosions ripped through the foundation. Victor's eyes widened as he realized his fortress was becoming his tomb. "What have you done?" "What my grandfather would have done," Marcus replied, swinging the iron poker in an arc that caught Victor across the ribs with a sickening crack. The terrorist leader stumbled but didn't fall, his military training keeping him upright despite obvious injury. He slashed wildly with his knife, catching Marcus across the forearm and drawing blood. They circled each other among the falling debris, both wounded now but neither willing to give ground. Victor was still stronger, but Marcus could see exhaustion and pain beginning to slow the larger man's movements. "Tell me," Marcus said, dodging another knife thrust. "Was it worth it? All this death and terror for money and revenge?" "You wouldn't understand," Victor spat. "You still believe in heroes and justice. The world taught me that only strength matters." "My grandfather believed in duty," Marcus replied, remembering the old man's stories about fighting in places where heroes were needed most. "He taught me that sometimes you have to stand between evil and innocent people, even when you can't win." Victor's laugh was bitter. Noble words from a dead man. But as he spoke, Victor made the mistake of glancing toward the passage where the hostages had escaped, perhaps calculating whether he could still catch them. That moment of distraction was all Marcus needed. He threw the iron poker like a spear, not at Victor but at the damaged keystone of the arch above the terrorist leader's head. The impact was just enough to complete what the artillery bombardment had begun. Victor looked up just as tons of medieval masonry came crashing down. The terrorist leader's scream was cut short as the castle's own weight crushed the man who had thought he could make it his impregnable fortress. Marcus dove toward the escape passage as the great hall collapsed behind him. Stone blocks the size of automobiles crashed into the space where he had been standing seconds before. The ancient castle was finally surrendering to time and explosives after standing defiant for 800 years. The escape tunnel was narrow and filled with dust. From the bombardment above, Marcus crawled through passages that seemed to shrink with each tremor from the artillery strikes. Several times, he had to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for his shoulders, following the path he had marked during his initial reconnaissance. Behind him, the sounds of destruction grew more distant as he worked his way deeper into the mountain's heart. The castle's collapse was sealing the tunnels, but Marcus had anticipated this possibility and chosen his route through the most stable passages in the limestone system. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Marcus saw light ahead. Not artificial light, but the gray pre-dawn glow of approaching sunrise. He emerged from a cave opening halfway down the cliff face to find a helicopter hovering nearby, its spotlight sweeping the rock formations. "Ghost, this is Rescue 1, came Admiral Harrison's voice through his radio. "We have all 11 hostages, safely aboard. What's your status?" Marcus looked back at the castle, now a pile of burning rubble on the mountain peak. Smoke rose from the destruction like incense from an ancient altar, carrying away the last remnants of Victor the Iron's reign of terror. "Mission accomplished, sir," Marcus replied, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. "The castle is neutralized and all hostiles are eliminated. Outstanding, Ghost. We're sending a recovery team to your position." As the rescue helicopter moved closer, Marcus could see faces pressed against the windows, the 11 Americans whose lives had hung in the balance for days. Jennifer, the Secretary of State's daughter, was gesturing excitedly as she spotted him clinging to the cliff face. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the successful mission or the lives he had saved. He was remembering his grandfather's weathered hands teaching him to tie climbing knots, the old man's voice explaining that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The rope ladder dropped from the helicopter, and Marcus began his final climb of the mission. As he was pulled up into safety, he could hear the hostages cheering and crying with relief. Admiral Harrison was there too, his stern face showing something that might have been pride. "Son," the admiral said, as Marcus collapsed onto the helicopter floor, "what you did in there, that was beyond any reasonable expectation of duty." Marcus managed a weak smile. "Sir, my grandfather always said that reasonable expectations don't save lives. Sometimes you have to attempt the unreasonable." Jennifer knelt beside him as the helicopter turned toward friendly territory. "How did you know you could do it? How did you know the tunnels would work?" Marcus looked out at the smoking remains of Castle Kronberg, thinking about all the times his father had taken him exploring in mountain caves, all the stories his grandfather had told about impossible missions during wartime. "I didn't know," he admitted. "But I knew that 11 people would die if I didn't try. Sometimes that's enough." As the helicopter flew toward the sunrise, carrying its precious cargo of rescued Americans, Marcus closed his eyes and heard his grandfather's voice one more time. "Well done, Beta. You found the path that others couldn't see." The boy who had learned to climb impossible peaks had just completed the most important climb of his life, and 11 families would be reunited because he had been willing to attempt what everyone else said couldn't be done. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the rose garden of the White House, wearing his dress uniform and feeling remarkably uncomfortable with all the attention focused on him. The president was speaking about courage and sacrifice, but Marcus found himself thinking about his grandfather, wishing the old Gurkha could have lived to see this moment. The Medal of Honor felt heavy around his neck, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it represented. 11 families had their loved ones back because of one night on a mountain, but Marcus knew the real heroes were the hostages who had kept their courage during days of captivity. After the ceremony, Admiral Harrison approached him with a manila folder. "Lieutenant, I have something that might interest you." Inside the folder were surveillance photos from various locations around the world: terrorist compounds, drug cartel strongholds, human trafficking operations. All of them shared one characteristic: they were considered impossible to assault using conventional military tactics. "We're forming a new unit," Admiral Harrison explained. "Specialists in unconventional warfare, people who can find solutions when traditional special forces reach their limits." Marcus studied the photos, seeing challenges that reminded him of Castle Kronberg. "What would you call this unit, sir?" Admiral Harrison smiled. "Officially? Special Operations Task Force Phantom. Unofficially, we're calling it the Ghost Division." Before Marcus could respond, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see Jennifer approaching, looking healthy and confident in a way that hadn't been possible during their terrifying night in the castle. "I wanted to thank you one more time," she said, extending her hand. "What you did, there aren't words for it." "You don't need to thank me," Marcus replied. "Anyone would have done the same thing." Jennifer shook her head firmly. "No, they wouldn't have. The Navy SEALs couldn't do it, Delta Force couldn't do it. But you found a way because you were willing to think differently." As the reception continued around them, Marcus found himself in conversation with several of the other rescued hostages. Each had a story about the night of the escape, details he hadn't known about their journey through the tunnel system. Dr. Peterson, a diplomat who had been held for 8 days, described the moment they heard the first artillery shell. "We thought we were all going to die. Then you appeared like something out of a movie, telling us to stay calm and follow you into what looked like solid stone wall." Sarah Williams, a trade representative, talked about the climb down through the cave system. "Those passages were so narrow and dark, but you seemed to know exactly where you were going, like you had some kind of internal compass." Marcus listened to their stories, realizing they had experienced the same night from completely different perspectives. To him, it had been a series of tactical problems to solve. To them, it had been a miracle of rescue appearing when hope had almost died. Later that evening, Marcus called his family from his hotel room. His sister answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting by the phone. "I saw you on television," she said, her voice filled with pride and tears. "Dad watched the ceremony 3 times. He kept saying, 'That's my boy, using everything the mountains taught him.'" "I kept thinking about Grandfather," Marcus admitted, "about all those stories he told us about impossible missions. He would have been so proud. You know what Dad said when he saw the news about the castle?" "What?" He said, "Marcus finally found a mountain that needed climbing." Marcus smiled, remembering how his father used to say that every person had a mountain they were meant to climb, but most people spent their whole lives looking for it. The next morning, Marcus reported to Admiral Harrison's office with his decision about the Ghost Division. The room was filled with maps and mission briefs, each representing another situation where conventional thinking had failed. "I'll take the assignment, sir," Marcus said without preamble, "but I have one condition." Admiral Harrison raised an eyebrow. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, Lieutenant. I want to recruit from outside traditional special forces," Marcus explained. "Mountain guides, cave explorers, people who've learned to solve problems that don't have standard solutions." "That's highly irregular." Marcus pointed to the mission. Briefs scattered across the Admiral's desk. "Sir, these situations are highly irregular. Maybe it's time we started thinking irregularly too." Admiral Harrison considered this for several moments. "You're talking about building a unit of civilians and soldiers who think like you do." "I'm talking about building a unit of people who've learned that impossible is just another word for something no one has tried yet." The Admiral made his decision quickly, as Marcus had learned he always did. "You have carte blanche to recruit whoever you think can get the job done." "But Marcus," he used the lieutenant's first name, something he had never done before, "the next mission won't have artillery support or backup plans. If you're wrong about unconventional thinking, then we'll fail unconventionally, sir, but at least we'll fail trying something that hasn't been attempted before." 3 months later, Lieutenant Marcus Chen stood on a training ground in Colorado, watching the strangest military unit ever assembled running obstacle courses designed by people who had never seen a military obstacle course in their lives. There was Elena, a Russian cave diver who had set world records exploring underwater caverns. James, an American free climber who had scaled buildings that architects swore were unclimbable. Kenji, a Japanese urban explorer who could navigate subway tunnels in cities he had never visited. They were learning to work together, combining civilian skills with military discipline, preparing for missions that traditional special forces couldn't handle. They called themselves Ghosts, and they were about to prove that sometimes the most impossible solutions were the most effective ones. As Marcus watched his unconventional team prepare for their first official mission, he thought about his grandfather one more time. The old Gurkha had always said that the best warriors were the ones who could find paths where others saw only walls. Looking at his team of misfits and specialists, Marcus realized they were about to show the world what happened when you stopped accepting the word impossible and started asking, what if we tried something completely different? The Ghost Division was ready for deployment, and somewhere in the world, people who thought they were in impossible situations were about to discover that impossible was just another mountain waiting to be climbed.